"She's not family, she's staff," Diane Whitfield said to a circle of 40 guests on the lawn behind her own house, and she said it the way people say something they believe is obvious and harmless, a fact rather than a wound. Her husband Marcus laughed, the short laugh people use when they want everyone around them to agree that nothing cruel has happened. I was standing 3 feet away, holding a tray of champagne I had ordered myself, in a dress I had pressed myself, at a party I had planned down to the napkin folds, and for a moment I did not move at all. Not because I was frozen, because I was finally, completely still. I had raised her 2 children from the week each of them came home from the hospital. I had been in that house for 18 years, and in front of 40 people who had eaten food I selected under string lights I had hung with my own hands 2 days earlier. Diane Whitfield needed everyone standing on that lawn to understand exactly where I stood. Before I tell you what happened after I set that tray down, and what her husband's face looked like 3 weeks later when an accountant laid 3 sheets of paper on his own kitchen table, tell me, where are you watching this from tonight? And what time is it where you are? I like knowing how far these stories travel before they're finished. My name is Teresa Alvarez. I am 58 years old, and for 18 years I worked for the Whitfield family in Lake Forest, Illinois, a quiet town on the North Shore of Chicago, where the houses sit back from Sheridan Road behind hedges older than most of the people who live behind them. I did not start as a household manager. I started as a nanny, hired when Sophie Whitfield was 11 days old, and her mother was not yet ready to be alone with her for an entire afternoon. I held that baby through 2 long bouts of colic that kept us both awake until 4 in the morning, walking the length of the nursery hallway so many times I could have done it with my eyes closed. I packed boxes through 3 moves while the family's first house was being gutted and rebuilt, keeping Sophie's routine steady in 3 different temporary apartments so she would never notice how much had changed around her. 2 years later, Ethan Whitfield was born, and I held him too, through his own colic, through an ear infection that kept him crying most nights for a month when he was 14 months old. I sat up with him in the rocking chair while Diane slept, because Diane had a client presentation in the morning and I did not. I taught both of those children to read, sitting on the same faded green rug in the playroom for years, moving from cardboard picture books to chapter books to, eventually, the thick paperbacks Sophie carried around at 13 like they were part of her own body. I sat through more than 400 piano recitals, soccer games, school plays, and at least 60 parent-teacher conferences, where I was introduced, when I was introduced at all, as the woman who helps us. I want to be honest about something. That introduction never bothered me as much as people might expect. I understood, or told myself I understood, that some families simply do not know how to name the person who is doing half the parenting alongside them, especially when that person is being paid to do it. There was a winter when Diane's own mother was dying 2 states away in Ohio, and Diane could not bring herself to get out of bed some mornings, and it was me who got the children dressed, fed, and to school. And it was me who sat with Diane in the kitchen afterward while she cried into a cup of coffee she never drank. I never once thought of that winter as work. What I did not expect, 18 years later, was for the phrase, "the woman who helps us," to grow teeth in front of 40 people who had known me for a decade. Diane ran a small boutique interior design business out of a converted carriage house near Market Square. The kind of business that photographed beautifully for the local magazine twice a year. And Marcus worked in commercial real estate finance downtown. The kind of job that kept him on the 710 Metra train 5 mornings a week, and required, in his mind, that the household simply run itself the way a well-oiled machine runs, without anyone visibly turning the gears. Somewhere around Ethan's 4th birthday, running the household became my job in every sense but the title. I was the one who hired Marisol Ortiz to handle the cleaning and laundry when Diane's business took off, and she could no longer keep the house herself. I was the one who let go, gently and with 2 weeks' severance out of my own suggestion, of a driver the family had used briefly. Once it became clear the children preferred me behind the wheel anyway. I was the one who found Lakeshore Household Payroll Services when Diane admitted, sitting at the kitchen island one evening with a glass of wine, that she had absolutely no idea how to legally pay a household employee, how to withhold the right taxes, how to file a Schedule H at the end of the year without breaking some law she'd only half heard of. I called them. I set the account up myself, sitting on hold for 40 minutes the first time, learning terms like FICA and Household Employer Identification Number from a patient woman on the other end of the line named Lauren Voss. For 14 years after that, I was the one who called Lauren every other Thursday to confirm hours and approve the payroll batch before it processed. My name sat quietly on that authorization, not because I ever asked for the power, but because nobody else in that house wanted the paperwork, and somebody had to sign it. And I was already there, already trusted with the children, the calendar, the caterers, the contractors, and eventually the money that paid everyone who kept the household running. I want to be clear about this because it matters later in the story. I never once asked for that authority. It was handed to me the way people hand things to whoever happens to be standing closest and looks capable of catching them, and then it is simply assumed, year after year, that the thing will keep being caught. The small disrespects arrived early and stayed quiet for a long time, the way water finds the lowest point in a floor before anyone notices the house is no longer level. The first Christmas after I became, in practice, the household administrator, Diane forgot my bonus entirely and remembered it 11 days later, apologizing by leaving an envelope on the kitchen counter with $300 in it and a sticky note that read, "Thank you for everything. We don't know what we'd do without you." I did not mention it. The following August, at Ethan's 8th birthday party, I was seated at the folding table with the catering staff, while family friends sat under the rented tent 20 feet away. And when Sophie, who was 10 at the time, asked loudly why I wasn't sitting with them, Diane told her I was working. I was not working in that moment. I was eating a hot dog standing up because there had not been a chair for me anywhere else on the property. 2 years after that, at a school open house, a teacher shook my hand and told me how lovely it was that Ethan's grandmother took such an active interest in his education, and Diane, standing right beside me, corrected her by saying, "Oh, she's not his grandmother. She's just been with us a long time," in a tone that made both descriptions sound equally beside the point. I noticed these things and set them aside, the way you set aside a splinter you don't have time to dig out, telling myself it would work its way to the surface eventually, and I would deal with it then. At Sophie's high school graduation, 5 years before the party on the lawn, the family took photographs on the front steps of the house, and when I stepped into the frame at Sophie's own insistence, Diane asked, pleasantly enough, whether I minded stepping just slightly to the side so the photo would still read as, in her words, an immediate family portrait. I stepped to the side. Sophie noticed, even at 18, and apologized to me quietly in the car 20 minutes later, which was more than either of her parents ever did. What I did not track carefully at first was the pattern building on the other side of the house, in Marcus's ledger rather than mine. Marisol worked long hours during the years both children were in competitive club sports, driving between 3 different practice facilities, managing laundry for 4 people, cooking for dinner parties that ran late into the night 3 or 4 times a month. Around the time Ethan turned 12, I began noticing that her overtime hours, which I logged faithfully every single week in a spreadsheet before sending them along to Lauren at Lakeshore, did not always match the hours Marcus approved when he glanced at the numbers before I submitted them. He would cross out an hour here, half an hour there, always with the same explanation that Marisol exaggerated, that she padded her timesheet a little, that he trusted my judgment more than hers, but the total still needed adjusting to fit what he called a reasonable household budget. I raised it with him twice, gently, standing in the kitchen at 10 at night, after everyone else had gone to bed. Both times he told me I was being too soft with the help, a phrase that landed strangely coming from a man who had never once, in 18 years, cleaned up after his own children without being asked twice. I kept my own separate record after that. A plain black composition notebook I bought for $4 at the drugstore on Western Avenue, where I wrote down Marisol's actual hours next to the hours that were finally submitted, week after week, for 6 years. I did not do this to build a case against anyone. I did it because I had learned, over nearly 2 decades in that house, that the people who kept quiet records were usually the only ones who were ever believed when something eventually went wrong. I filed the notebook in the bottom drawer of the kitchen desk, under a stack of school directories nobody had opened since Ethan started high school, and most weeks I honestly forgot it was there at all. I never showed it to Marisol. She worked hard, kept her head down, and thanked me every Friday for making sure her check arrived on time, never once suspecting that the number in her account most weeks was smaller than the number I had actually recorded on her behalf. I told myself, for 6 years, that raising it with Marcus a 3rd time would only cost me whatever leverage I had left to protect her in smaller ways. An extra half-day off here, a ride to her daughter's dentist appointment there, and that the notebook itself was protection enough for a day I hoped would never actually come. The anniversary party was Diane's idea from the start, a full 18th wedding anniversary celebration on the back lawn, string lights strung between the old oaks, a jazz trio she'd hired after seeing one at a friend's fundraiser, 40 guests from the country club and the design business in Marcus's firm. I planned nearly all of it myself, over 3 weeks, the way I had planned every major gathering in that house since Sophie's christening 18 years earlier. I ordered the champagne, $340 for 6 cases from the wine shop on Western Avenue, paid on the household card, and logged in my own spreadsheet the same afternoon. I hired the catering staff and walked the menu with them twice, once for the tasting and once the week before to finalize timing. I hung the string lights myself on a borrowed ladder because the contractor Diane hired canceled 2 days before the event, and I did not mention to Diane how long that had taken or how badly my shoulder ached afterward. Sophie, 21 now, and home from college for the summer, helped me fold the last of the napkins the afternoon of the event, and at one point, she hugged me from behind while I was arranging the dessert table and said, "You know you're the reason any of this ever comes together, right? None of it happens without you." I told her I knew, and I meant it, and for a moment, that was genuinely enough. The moment itself happened just after 8, when the light was starting to go gold over the lake bluff, and most of the guests had a glass of something in hand. A woman I did not recognize, a friend of Diane's from the club named Patricia, asked me pleasantly whether I was family, since I seemed to know absolutely everyone so well, and moved through the party like I belonged to it in a way most guests didn't. Before I could answer, Diane laughed, a light social laugh meant to smooth over what she must have registered as an awkward question, and said, "Oh no, she's not family. She's staff. She's been with us forever. We genuinely couldn't survive without her." I understood, even in that instant, that Diane believed she was being generous. In her mind, she had just handed me the highest compliment available to someone in my position. What she did not understand, or did not care to consider, was what 40 people now understood, all at once, about where I stood in a house I had run for 18 years of my life. Marcus, standing beside her with a drink in his hand, laughed the short laugh and added, "Don't take it personally, Teresa. You know how it is around here." I did not respond immediately. I looked at Sophie, who had gone completely still on the other side of the dessert table, her hand frozen midair over a stack of plates. I looked at Ethan, 19 now, who had the decency to look down at the grass instead of at me. Then I asked Diane one question, quietly, so it would not become more of a scene than it already was. I asked her who she thought had been signing Marisol's payroll for the last 14 years. Diane blinked, genuinely confused, and said, "You handle that, don't you?" in the same easy tone she might have used to answer a question about which caterer we'd used that night. I told her that was correct, and that I had been the authorized signer on the household payroll account since Sophie was 4 years old, and that I would be stepping away from that responsibility as of Monday morning. I set the tray down on the linen tablecloth, not hard, not dramatically, simply down, the glasses ringing softly against each other. And I walked into the house, took my purse from its hook in the mudroom, and drove home while the jazz trio was still playing the same song they'd been playing when I left. I did not sleep much that night, but I did not cry either. I sat at my own kitchen table in the small brick house I owned 2 miles away, in Highwood, a house I had bought myself 12 years earlier with money I had saved for a decade. And I thought about 18 years. And I thought about the black composition notebook still sitting in the bottom drawer of a desk in a house I no longer intended to enter. I made a decision that had nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with simply telling the truth about my own life going forward. On Monday morning at 9:15, I called Lauren Voss at Lakeshore Household Payroll Services, the same woman I had spoken to every other Thursday for 14 years. and I told her I was resigning as the authorized signer on the Whitfield household account, effective immediately, and that any future authorization would need to come directly from Diane or Marcus Whitfield, in writing, in person, at their branch office if necessary. Lauren was quiet for a moment on the line, then asked carefully if everything was all right. I told her everything was fine, that I had simply decided it was time to stop being the one who held that particular piece of paper. I did not mention the party. I did not mention Marisol's hours. I gave notice on my own position at the house the same morning, in a short email to Diane, effective in 2 weeks, enough time to help the children, who were adults now in every legal sense, adjust to my absence, though I privately suspected they would need far less help with that than their mother would. What I did not anticipate, because I genuinely was not thinking about consequences at all in that moment, was what would happen inside Lakeshore's system once my authorization was formally removed. Lauren called me back that same afternoon, this time with a different tone in her voice, more careful, more official, the tone of someone reading from a script she didn't like reading from. She explained that when she went to process the next payroll batch, $4,860.32 across 3 household employees, the system flagged the account because there was no longer a valid authorized signer on file. And when she called the Whitfield house to ask Diane to complete the necessary paperwork herself, Diane did not know the account required a signer at all. She had assumed, apparently for 14 years, that the payroll simply ran itself. The way she assumed the house simply ran itself. The way she assumed a great many things in her life simply happened on schedule because someone competent was standing nearby making sure they did. Lauren asked, carefully, whether there was anything else about the account I thought she should know before formally transferring the file over to a new administrator. I told her the truth, because by then I had decided that telling the truth when directly asked was the one thing I still owed myself. I told her there was a notebook in the bottom kitchen drawer, and that if anyone at Lakeshore, or an accountant, ever needed to reconcile Marisol Ortiz's actual hours against what had been submitted over the past 6 years, the numbers would not match, and I could not speak to why, only that I had recorded exactly what I witnessed, week after week, because I had learned a long time ago that someone should. I did not send the notebook to anyone. I did not photograph it. I did not mention it to Marisol. I simply answered a direct question honestly and let the facts sit exactly where they already were. 3 weeks later, an accountant the Whitfields used for their household filings, a careful, unhurried man named Harold Kessler, who had handled their taxes for over a decade, came by the house to review the payroll transition and, following standard procedure once a discrepancy had been flagged by Lakeshore's own system, pulled Marisol's submitted hours against her original timesheets, which Lakeshore still had on file going back 6 full years. The numbers did not reconcile. Harold sat at the same kitchen island where Diane had once told me about her Schedule H worries 14 years earlier, and found roughly $9,214.60 in unpaid overtime owed to Marisol Ortiz. Wages that had been logged correctly, week after week, by someone with a spreadsheet, and then reduced before submission by someone else with access to the account before it ever reached Lakeshore. When Harold asked Diane directly who had been making those particular adjustments, Diane, for the first time in this entire story, did not have an easy answer, because the adjustments had never once come from her. They had come from Marcus quietly at that same kitchen table at night for 6 years, while Diane believed her household finances were simply being handled competently by the people she trusted to handle them, myself included, without ever once asking how. Harold, a man not given to drama of any kind, later told Sophie that in 22 years of reviewing household accounts across the North Shore, he had seen families miss a payment or misclassify a worker by accident more times than he could count. But he had rarely seen 6 consecutive years of the exact same small reduction, applied by the exact same hand, on the exact same day of the pay cycle, which was, in his careful professional opinion, not the pattern of an accident at all. Marisol learned about the discrepancy the same week Harold found it, not from me and not from the Whitfields directly, but from Lauren Voss at Lakeshore, who was required by the payroll company's own policy to notify any employee once a wage correction above a certain threshold had been identified on their account. Marisol called me that evening, something she had never done in 6 years of working alongside me in that house, and asked, quietly, whether I had known. I told her the truth, that I had known the numbers didn't match for years, that I had written them down because I didn't know what else to do with information I couldn't prove and didn't feel was mine to weaponize, and that I was sorry it had taken this long for the truth to reach her in a form anyone else would believe. She was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she said simply that she had always wondered why the checks felt smaller some months than the hours she remembered working, and that she had assumed she was the one misremembering. $9,000, she told me later, was the difference between the used car she'd been driving for 4 years and a newer one with fewer than 60,000 miles on it, which she bought the same month Marcus's check cleared. The family meeting happened on a Tuesday evening in July, in that same kitchen, 3 weeks and 2 days after the party. I was not there, and I want to say clearly that I did not ask to be there and would not have gone if invited. Sophie told me about it 3 days later over coffee at a diner on Green Bay Road, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and burnt coffee that neither of us had ever gone to together before, because we had never once needed neutral ground before that summer. She told me her father had tried, at first, sitting across from Harold's neatly stacked printouts, to say the whole discrepancy was a misunderstanding, a rounding error, something Marisol herself must have miscounted over the years. Harold, who had brought both sets of records with him in a manila folder, simply set the pages side by side on the table and said calmly that the handwriting on the original submissions matched Teresa's spreadsheet exactly, week after week, for 6 years, and that the only adjustments made after those submissions left her hands were entered from a different device, logged under a different login, at hours of the night when Teresa herself had already gone home. Diane asked her husband directly, in front of both of their adult children, whether he had been quietly altering a household employee's hours for 6 years to save what amounted to roughly $1,500 a year. Marcus tried to explain that it was never really about the money, that he simply thought the number felt high some weeks and adjusted it on instinct. Diane, according to Sophie, went very quiet for a long moment and then said that $1,500 a year for 6 years was over $9,000 taken from a woman raising 2 children on her own in a 2-bedroom apartment in Waukegan, and asked him plainly what exactly he thought that money had been about, if not the money itself. Ethan, who had said almost nothing since the party, told his father that he'd spent 19 years watching Teresa show up for absolutely everything in that house, and had never once, until that lawn in July, heard either of his parents describe what she actually was to their family, only what she wasn't. Marcus told him he was being dramatic. Sophie, according to her own account of the evening, stood up from the table at that point, said she needed air, and did not come back inside for almost 20 minutes, during which time, she told me later, she sat on the same back steps where the graduation photograph had been taken 5 years earlier and cried for the first time since the party itself. The consequences arrived the way real consequences usually do in a house like that. Not loudly, not in a single dramatic evening, but structurally, in places that mattered more over time than any one uncomfortable dinner ever could. Marcus paid Marisol the full $9,214.60 within a week, along with a formal letter from Harold's firm acknowledging the underpayment in writing. Because Harold made clear that without swift correction, the discrepancy would need to be reported as part of the family's annual household filing, which could trigger a state labor department review and back tax penalties Harold estimated could run as high as $18,400 once interest and household employment tax corrections were factored in. Diane took over the household administration herself for the first time in her adult life that August, hiring a professional bookkeeper through Lakeshore's own referral service rather than trusting the account to run on faith and goodwill the way it had for 14 years. Lauren Voss called me one final time that October, mostly, she admitted, out of her own curiosity rather than any professional necessity, since the account had long since been transferred. She told me the new bookkeeper Diane hired had asked her, during the handover, how long a household typically kept the same authorized signer once one was established, and Lauren had told her 14 years was, in her 15 years at Lakeshore, the longest she had ever seen, and that most families rotated the responsibility every few years, without ever quite realizing they were supposed to. I asked her why she thought the Whitfields never had. She said kindly that in her experience, families rarely change something that appears to be working, and appearances, in a house like that one, had always mattered more than most people wanted to admit out loud. Marcus, for his part, lost something less measurable, but no less real to him. Word moves quietly through a town like Lake Forest, the way it moves through any small, wealthy place where everyone eventually plays golf with everyone else, and within a few months, 2 different men at his club mentioned, in the careful way people mention things they've only heard secondhand, that they'd heard something about the Whitfields and their housekeeper, and Marcus found himself explaining, more than once, a story that had no version left in it, that made him look like anything other than exactly what the numbers showed him to be. He resigned from a small volunteer finance committee at the club that fall, quietly, without any public explanation, a position he had held for 9 years, and had always mentioned first whenever anyone asked what he did outside of work. Diane later told Sophie she suspected 2 of the other committee members had asked him to step down once they'd heard even a partial version of the story secondhand, though nobody ever said so to his face, because that particular kind of town rarely says anything to anyone's face at all. Diane herself changed in smaller, quieter ways that took longer to notice than her husband's. She began sitting in on the household bookkeeper's monthly review in person, something I had never once seen her do in 18 years, asking questions about categories and totals she had previously never so much as glanced at. She told Sophie at some point that fall that reviewing the numbers herself for the first time had made her realize how much of her own life she had handed to other people to hold. Not only the payroll, but the school forms, the birthday parties, the small daily decisions that had quietly built the shape of her children's childhoods while she was in the next room or the next town, working. I do not think Diane became a different person that year. I think she became a slightly more honest version of the person she had always been, which is, in its own way, its own kind of consequence. I was not present for any of this directly, and I want to be honest that I did not go looking for the details the way this story might make it sound like I did. I learned most of it from Sophie, in pieces, over 4 or 5 visits that summer, because Sophie was the one who kept showing up at my door in Highwood with 2 coffees and a bag of pastries from the bakery near her old high school. The way a daughter checks on someone she is genuinely worried about. Ethan called twice that August. Awkward, halting phone calls, where he mostly apologized for not saying anything at the party, for looking at the grass instead of at me, and I told him both times that he had been 19 years old, standing on his own family's lawn, and that I had never once expected a 19-year-old to correct his mother in front of 40 guests. Though I told him honestly that I appreciated the calls more than he probably realized. Diane wrote me an actual letter in late August, on paper, not a text message, which surprised me enough that I read it standing in my own doorway before I'd even taken my coat off. She apologized for the exact words she'd used at the party and admitted, in a line I read 3 separate times that evening, that she had spent 18 years being grateful for me in the way people are grateful for good weather, simply assuming I would always be there, without ever once asking herself what I might need in return for 18 years of assuming. She did not ask me to come back. I think by the time she wrote that letter, she understood there was no version of coming back that made honest sense for either of us anymore. I did not forgive quickly, and I do not think quick forgiveness would have meant much of anything in a situation built on 18 years of small, accumulated dismissals. What I did instead, slowly, over the following months, was let the relationship become something smaller and considerably more honest than what it had been before. I met Sophie for coffee every few weeks through the fall, and when she called in October to say Ethan had been accepted early into a graduate program the following spring, I told her I was proud of him, and I meant every word of it, because whatever pride I felt for those 2 children had never once actually depended on my employment status in their parents' house. Diane and I have spoken exactly twice since that letter arrived, both times briefly, both times without either of us pretending the 18 years had simply resumed where they left off. I found part-time work that fall managing the household calendar and correspondence for 2 other families in town. Work that pays considerably less than what I'd effectively been doing for the Whitfields, but asks far less of me in return. And for the first time in 18 years, I sign my own timesheet myself and hand it directly to a payroll company, with no one standing between my hours and the number that finally reaches my account. Marisol and I still have coffee most Sunday mornings, something we never made time for in all our years working in the same house together, when our days off rarely lined up, and there was always a child who needed one of us. She bought her newer car that October, the one with 60,000 miles instead of nearly 200,000, and she drove it to my house the first weekend she had it, just to show me the way you show someone who has earned the right to see it. She told me once, over coffee, that she wished she'd kept her own notebook the way I had, and I told her that keeping one was never about being clever, only about refusing to let someone else's version of events become the only version that existed. 6 months after the party, on a mild evening the following spring, Sophie graduated early from her program and invited me to the small dinner her parents hosted to celebrate, held at a restaurant on the lakefront rather than the house itself, which I noticed and quietly chose not to mention to anyone. I went that evening as a guest, seated at the table itself, between Sophie and an aunt I had met a dozen times over the years at holidays, where I had always eaten in the kitchen with the other staff. Diane raised a glass at one point during dinner and thanked everyone who had helped Sophie become who she was. And she looked directly at me when she said it, holding my gaze for a second longer than the toast required, and I let her. I did not need a bigger gesture than that from her, not anymore. Marcus did not look at me at all that evening, and somewhere over the course of that dinner, I noticed, almost with surprise, that I did not need anything from him either. Not an apology, not an explanation, nothing at all. Looking back now, I think the truest thing I can say about those 18 years is that I never once wanted revenge against either of them. Not on the night of the party, not in the weeks after, not even now, telling this story out loud for the first time. What I wanted, and what I finally gave myself, was the simple right to stop quietly proving my own worth to people who had never once bothered to decide in 18 years whether I was family or furniture. Being called staff on that lawn was not what changed my life. Realizing I had spent 18 years silently earning a place I was never actually going to be given was what finally did. So I will ask you the same question I sometimes ask myself late at night. If you gave 20 years of your life to a family that called you help in front of everyone the moment it mattered least, would you have stayed silent that evening on the lawn? Or would you have set the tray down too, quietly, and walked into the house to make one phone call on your own terms? This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, education, and reflection, with the assistance of artificial intelligence, and any resemblance to real people, names, or events is entirely coincidental. Nothing in this video constitutes legal or financial advice. If this stayed with you, I would love to hear where you're watching from tonight, and I hope you'll come back for the next one.